Darius Miles could feel every eye in the lecture hall press against his skin like the heat of a spotlight. The classroom was too quiet for this early in the morning, and too bright. The kind of bright that didn't let you hide. He had just answered a question, calmly, clearly, confidently. A question about Kant and the categorical imperative. And for a moment, it seemed like he might have nailed it. Until the silence stretched, and then. "Oh," Professor Halpern said, dramatically raising his eyebrows. "That's quite the interpretation." He stepped away from the podium, clasping his hands behind his back like he was about to deliver a monologue from a Shakespeare play. "Tell me, Mr. Miles, is that something you picked up on Twitter or the back of a cereal box?" Laughter cracked through the room, scattered but sharp. Darius didn't flinch, didn't look down. He just stared ahead. Straight into the professor's squinting, satisfied face. That same look Halpern gave anyone who stepped even slightly out of line with his rigid, Eurocentric, academic expectations. Darius forced himself to blink slowly, calmly. He wasn't new to moments like this. But damn, it didn't get easier. Would anyone like to respond to Mr. Miles' unique interpretation? Halpern continued, turning toward the class like he was emceeing a comedy roast instead of running a college seminar. "No. Don't all rush at once." More laughter. Darius gripped the sides of his desk. Not hard. Just enough to keep from getting up and walking out. From the second row, a girl with red hair, Jessica, the teaching assistant, looked up from her notebook. Their eyes met for a second. She didn't smile. She didn't look away, either. Outside, the autumn wind swept across the stone courtyard. Inside, Darius sat still while his dignity was being slowly sliced apart under the flickering lights of a 100-year-old classroom. The humiliation stung, but it didn't show. Not on the outside. Darius had mastered the art of stillness a long time ago. His mom used to say, sometimes, you win just by not giving them the reaction they want. So he didn't react. He waited. Watched. Memorized every detail, the snickers, the smug look on Professor Halpern's face, the silence of the other students. After class, Darius didn't move right away. He waited for the room to mostly empty out, until only a few people remained gathering their things. Jessica was packing up her notes. Professor Halpern had already disappeared into his office like he hadn't just used a 20-year-old student as target practice in front of 50 others. Darius finally stood and slung his backpack over one shoulder. As he turned to leave, Jessica approached him. "Hey," she said quietly. "I just wanted to say, your point about Kant wasn't wrong." Darius gave a short nod. Didn't feel like that mattered much. "No," she said, her voice dropping, "it didn't. But it will." He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't have the energy. Outside, the cold hit him like a slap. The trees had started to shed their leaves. Red and yellow littered the pavement like confetti from a celebration he hadn't been invited to. He walked across campus with his head high, but the ache sat deep in his chest, twisting. It wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated. It wasn't even the first time in that classroom. But this time felt different. This time, Halpern hadn't just dismissed his answer, he tried to reduce him. Make him small. Like he didn't belong in that chair, in that room, in that world. Back at his dorm, Darius dropped his bag and collapsed into his desk chair. His roommate, Carlos, spun around in his gaming chair, headset hanging around his neck. "You okay, bro?" Darius stared at the wall for a second. He did it again. Carlos frowned. "Halpern? Publicly. Tried to clown me in front of everyone." Carlos shook his head. "Man, you should file something. That dude's a menace." Darius sighed. "And say what? My tenured white professor made me look stupid in a room full of mostly white kids, again. You think the school doesn't already know how he is?" Carlos didn't respond right away. He just watched Darius, then turned back to his screen. You ever think about clapping back? Not like, disrespect. But, like, really prepare and just, kill it next time? Darius didn't answer. Not because he hadn't thought of it. But because he had. Over and over. He wasn't going to yell. He wasn't going to make a scene. He was going to do something worse. He was going to prove him wrong. The next day, Darius sat at the library for hours. He combed through readings, cross-checked footnotes, and built arguments sharper than any retort Halpern could throw at him. He knew how the professor played. Twisting words, rewarding familiarity over originality, favoring students who echoed his own views. But Darius had something Halpern wasn't ready for, a mind that refused to shrink. The morning after, as the lecture hall buzzed with low chatter, Darius walked in early. Sat in the same seat. Same row. Same stare. But this time, his eyes held something else. Not fire. Not rage. Precision. When Halpern called on him again, expecting hesitation, Darius delivered a response so concise, so backed by textual evidence, the room went still. Halpern cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Interesting, he muttered. Though perhaps, a bit interpretive. Interpretation, Darius replied, voice calm, is the basis of philosophy, isn't it? A few students turned their heads. Jessica stopped writing. Halpern adjusted his glasses. Said nothing. Darius leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and looked directly at the professor. He didn't need applause. He didn't need revenge. What he wanted was clarity. A stage built on facts, not egos. And something had shifted. One moment. One answer. One student. The room hadn't cheered. But it hadn't laughed either. And sometimes, silence was a beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Darius Miles had never been a stranger to hardship. In fact, it seemed like the world had been trying to teach him resilience from the moment he was born. Growing up in a neighborhood like Old Fourth Ward in Atlanta, opportunities weren't handed to you, they were earned, fought for, and sometimes, they felt like they slipped right through your fingers. But Darius had something else, a quiet but unshakable determination. He could still remember the days when his mother would stay up late, grading papers by the dim light of a lamp. She was a teacher, smart, strong, a woman who believed in the power of education. But she wasn't just a teacher, she was a fighter. When Darius was young, she raised him on her own after his father, a once promising college athlete, got caught up in the wrong crowd. He ended up in prison, leaving his mother to pick up the pieces of their broken family. Still, she never complained. Instead, she worked 3 jobs to keep the lights on, make sure Darius had a bed to sleep in, and, more than anything, instill in him the belief that education was his way out. Your brain is the only thing no one can take away from you, she'd say, as she scribbled lesson plans at the kitchen table. You protect that. You let it work for you, and nobody can touch you. Darius had taken those words to heart. His love for learning wasn't just a result of his mother's influence, it was his lifeline. When life felt heavy, his textbooks were always there to provide a sense of escape, a sense of control. He'd read everything from history to philosophy to science, and he found beauty in the way the world worked, even if it sometimes felt like the world itself didn't care about him. At the age of 17, Darius received a scholarship to attend a prestigious university. It was a huge deal, bigger than he had ever dreamed. He could see the pride in his mother's eyes as she stood beside him on the steps of the university, holding back tears. She had worked so hard to get him to this point, and now it was his turn to make the most of it. But as soon as Darius set foot on campus, he realized that this new world came with its own set of challenges. Sure, the campus was beautiful, the classroom state-of-the-art, and the library vast and filled with knowledge. But that knowledge, it seemed, didn't always come with an understanding of him. He was one of only a few black students in a sea of mostly white faces. Every interaction, every conversation, every class felt like a reminder that he didn't quite fit in here, even though he had earned his spot. It wasn't about the work. No, his grades were stellar. But it was the subtle, everyday slights, the way people looked at him like he didn't belong, like his success had come from some form of charity rather than effort. It wasn't long before Darius encountered Professor Richard Halpern, a man whose reputation for being brilliant also came with whispers of his elitism, his old-school ways, and his belief that only a certain type of student could truly thrive in the world of academia. Halpern seemed to have little patience for students who didn't speak the same intellectual language he did, especially if those students happened to look different. That's when Darius began to understand the real weight of the challenge he was facing. It wasn't just about learning the material. It wasn't just about getting good grades. It was about proving to everyone, especially to people like Professor Halpern, that he deserved to be here, that he wasn't just taking up space. At first, he tried to ignore it. He went to class, did his assignments, kept his head down. But after the incident in the lecture hall, the one where Halpern had humiliated him in front of everyone, Darius felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just about proving that he could do the work. It wasn't about trying to show the professor up. It was about something deeper, the quiet, persistent need to claim his own worth. Darius thought about the times his mother had stayed up late, teaching him lessons that weren't in any textbook. "Don't let them make you small," she had always said. "Don't let anyone take your worth away from you." But how do you stand tall in a place that constantly reminds you that you don't belong? How do you stay grounded when every day feels like a test of your resolve? As Darius walked through the campus after class, his mind wandered back to those early days, the smell of his mother's cooking filling their tiny apartment, the sound of her soft humming as she worked at the kitchen table. He could almost hear her voice now. "You are bigger than any challenge this world throws at you, Darius. You're not here by accident." His phone buzzed. It was a message from Carlos. "Man, you're gonna handle Halpern tomorrow, right?" Darius smiled, but the tension in his chest didn't let up. Carlos was always ready to go to battle for him. But Darius knew that this fight wasn't about making noise or raising hell. It was about strategy, about using his mind to outsmart the game they wanted to play. The next day, Darius woke up early. He sat at his desk and read through the materials for Halpern's class again, making notes and connecting ideas. His goal wasn't to get back at the professor. It was to show him, show everyone, that he didn't need to play by their rules. He had his own. As he walked into the lecture hall, he felt the familiar weight of eyes on him again. But this time, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel diminished. He walked straight to his seat and took a deep breath. Today would be different. Today, he would show them that his worth was never in question. Darius knew he had a long road ahead. But one thing was clear, he wasn't just going to survive here. He was going to make this space his own. Professor Richard Halpern had always been an enigma. To his colleagues, he was a revered intellectual, the kind of academic who lived and breathed philosophy, ethics, and the classics. His lectures were meticulously constructed, and his vast knowledge commanded respect. But there was something about him that made students uneasy, an air of superiority, a sense that he believed only those who mirrored his worldview could truly understand the depth of his teachings. But what most didn't know was that Richard Halpern's worldview had been shaped by something far deeper than books or theories. It was something he rarely spoke about, something he had buried so deeply that even he had almost forgotten it. But on the rare occasion when his guard slipped, his eyes would flicker with a brief moment of something darker, an old wound he could never fully heal. Growing up in a small, predominantly white town in the Midwest, Halpern had never really experienced the kind of challenges that Darius and others like him faced daily. He was the golden child, gifted, well-connected, and surrounded by a world that nurtured his ambitions. His parents were both university professors, and from an early age, Halpern had been groomed to take his place in the halls of academia. Excellence was expected, and failure was never an option. As a young man, Halpern had been determined to make his mark, to climb the ladder of success. He'd been the brilliant student, the one professors turned to for answers in the classroom, the one whose opinions were always sought after in discussions. It wasn't until he reached graduate school that he encountered his first real challenge. It was during a critical seminar on post-colonialism, a subject that felt too foreign, too distant for someone like him, raised in a world that had never had to confront the true complexity of race, privilege, and history. He had been assigned to work on a project about colonial oppression and the role of Western philosophers in justifying imperialism. At first, Halpern approached it with the same arrogance he applied to everything else. He believed he could master the subject without fully understanding it, relying only on the intellectual tools he had honed for years. But the more he researched, the more unsettled he became. He began to feel something unfamiliar, guilt. The deeper he dug into the history of colonialism, the more he realized how much his privileged life had been built on systems of power that were designed to oppress others. He could no longer ignore the truth, that his success, his position in academia, was inextricably linked to centuries of exploitation. He was part of a system that had allowed him to flourish while others had been crushed beneath it. That guilt festered, and instead of confronting it, Halpern retreated. He doubled down on his belief that the only way to succeed in academia was to separate himself from these uncomfortable truths. He would teach and write about philosophy, history, and ethics as if they were abstract ideas, detached from the messy reality of race and oppression. In his eyes, the world of ideas was sacred, and no one, especially not students like Darius, had the right to bring in the messy, real-world consequences of those ideas. To him, it was easier to believe that the academic world could exist in a vacuum, untouched by the biases and inequalities that ran rampant outside the ivory tower. But deep down, Halpern's own past haunted him. He had never truly faced the realities of the very issues he lectured on. His denial, however, only made him more defensive, more rigid in his views, more dismissive of anyone who challenged him. He began to view students like Darius with a mix of resentment and confusion. How could someone from a background so different from his understand the intricacies of philosophy? How could someone who didn't come from his world have the audacity to challenge the intellectual norms he had spent his entire life perfecting? It was in this context that he first met Darius Miles. Darius had impressed Halpern from the start. His insights into ethics and philosophy were fresh, unencumbered by the stale biases that colored so many of the professor's peers. But Halpern couldn't help but feel threatened by Darius's unorthodox approach. It was something raw and real, something that made Halpern's carefully constructed walls start to crack. And so, when Darius had the audacity to question him, publicly, in front of the class, Halpern reacted as he always did when faced with a challenge: he struck back. Dismiss, belittle, dominate. That was the only way to maintain control. But the more he thought about Darius's response, the calm, measured way he had stood up to Halpern, the more disturbed Halpern became. What was it about this young man that got under his skin? What was it about Darius that made Halpern feel as if he were losing his grip on the narrative? The following day, after the class had ended and the students filed out, Halpern sat alone in his office, contemplating the events of the lecture. His hand hovered over the stack of papers on his desk, but his mind wasn't on the grading. It was on Darius. He couldn't help but wonder if Darius was somehow challenging him not just as a student, but as a man. A man who had spent his life running away from the uncomfortable truths he had once confronted and buried. Could it be that Darius was forcing him to face those same truths once again? And could it be that, for the first time in years, Halpern wasn't entirely sure he could win this fight? As Halpern's thoughts swirled, he found himself staring out the window, watching the students walk across the quad below. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, and for a brief moment, Halpern felt something unfamiliar, a twinge of uncertainty. He had spent so long lecturing others, so long hiding behind his credentials and theories, that he had forgotten what it was like to truly question his own beliefs. But now, Darius Miles had planted the seed. And Halpern wasn't sure how it was going to grow. The tension in the classroom lingered after that fateful day. The professor-student dynamic between Darius Miles and Professor Halpern had shifted into something more than just a typical academic relationship. Darius knew that Halpern had a fragile ego, but he never imagined it would impact their interactions so drastically. Every glance from the professor now felt charged with unspoken challenges, an invisible battle of wills that Darius never asked for, but was now caught in. The next few weeks passed in a blur, each class like a tightrope walk. Darius could sense that Halpern's patience with him was wearing thin. The professor would call on him more frequently, almost as if to test him. His questions sharper, more probing, as though he wanted to expose Darius's weaknesses. But Darius was resolute. He stood his ground in every lecture, his answers calm and thoughtful, refusing to let Halpern intimidate him. It wasn't until a particularly heated discussion in a smaller seminar that things took an unexpected turn. Darius had just responded to a complex question about Kantian ethics when Halpern's voice broke through, cutting him off. "Do you even understand what you're saying, Miles? Or are you just repeating something you've read without truly understanding the implications?" Halpern's words came out like a sharp slap, the room falling silent in the wake of his critique. Darius could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he held his ground. He wasn't about to let Halpern off the hook for this one. "Actually, Professor, I understand the concepts very well, and I'm applying them to the real world. Maybe that's something you're missing. It's not just about theory, it's about how theory affects real lives." A few of the other students shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Darius and the professor. No one had dared to challenge Halpern so directly in years. But Darius didn't care anymore. Something inside him had clicked. If he was going to be here, if he was going to stay in this academic world, he couldn't afford to back down. Halpern's face turned a shade darker, but before he could respond, a voice interrupted. "Actually, I agree with Darius," came a calm, measured voice from the back of the room. Darius turned around in surprise. It was Sarah, a quiet student who had always sat at the back of the classroom, her face often buried in books. She was one of the few students who had remained neutral during the tensions between Darius and Halpern, and Darius had never really spoken to her before. Now, here she was, siding with him. The room shifted again, the atmosphere charged with a new energy. Sarah continued, her voice steady. "I think Darius makes a good point. Ethics and philosophy aren't just about what's in the books. They're about how we live them. And maybe that's something we should talk about more openly in class." Halpern stared at her, clearly caught off guard. "Are you suggesting that we abandon the academic rigor of these discussions in favor of personal experiences?" His voice dripped with condescension. "I'm not suggesting we abandon rigor," Sarah responded, her tone unwavering. "I'm suggesting that we broaden the scope of our discussions to include perspectives that are often overlooked, perspectives that challenge the status quo." Darius is right. Theory only matters if it can be applied to real life. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. Halpern's lips twitched, his pride visibly bruised. He had never expected a student like Sarah to speak up, let alone defend Darius. The moment felt pivotal, like a turning point that neither of them had anticipated. The tension in the room wasn't just about Darius and Halpern anymore. It was about something bigger, the battle for space, for voices that had been marginalized, for the kind of education that wasn't limited by outdated biases. Halpern cleared his throat, his expression darkening. "We'll continue this discussion another time. Let's move on," he said curtly, clearly unwilling to admit he had been bested in front of the class. The class proceeded in awkward silence, but Darius couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. Sarah had done something he didn't expect. She had not only supported him, but she had also brought a new perspective to the conversation. One that had shifted the balance of power, even if just for a moment. After class, Darius found Sarah waiting for him by the door, her books tucked under her arm. "You were amazing back there," Darius said, genuinely surprised. I didn't expect you to speak up. Sarah smiled softly, but there was a weariness in her eyes. It's just, you're right. I've been in these classes for months, and it's all the same. No one's talking about the real stuff, the things that actually matter. I had to say something. Darius nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude toward her. It wasn't often that someone stood up for him, let alone someone who had stayed so quiet throughout the semester. But Sarah's words held weight. She wasn't just agreeing with him for the sake of being agreeable. She understood what he was fighting for. Look, Sarah continued, her voice lower now, I know we don't really know each other, but I think we could be allies in this. I've been watching what's been happening with you and Halpern, and I get it. It's not just about what's on the syllabus. It's about pushing for something more. Darius was taken aback by her sincerity. He had been so focused on his own battle with Halpern that he hadn't realized how much the classroom dynamic had affected others. He hadn't realized how many students felt the same way but didn't have the courage to speak up. Thanks, Darius said, his voice softening. I appreciate it. I think I could use someone who gets it. For the first time in weeks, Darius felt a small glimmer of hope. The classroom had become a battlefield, and he had been standing alone in the fight. But with Sarah by his side, maybe it wouldn't have to be a solo war. Maybe, just maybe, they could start something bigger than just the classroom. As they walked out of the building together, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He didn't know how it would unfold, but he knew one thing for certain, this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something much larger than either of them had imagined. The weeks that followed Sarah's surprising support had been a turning point for Darius, but the feeling of unease never quite left him. Professor Halpern's attitude towards him had become colder, more distant, yet undeniably intense. Halpern's verbal sparring had shifted from challenging Darius's ideas in class to subtle, almost imperceptible slights, awkward pauses when he called on Darius, a slight narrowing of his eyes when their paths crossed in the hallway, and a barely audible scoff whenever Darius spoke up in discussion. But Darius had learned to push through it. He wasn't going to let Halpern, or anyone, stop him from speaking his truth, especially after Sarah had shown him that he wasn't alone. He'd begun to see their small rebellion against the status quo as a glimmer of possibility, a chance to dismantle the invisible walls of silence that had kept him from standing up in the first place. Sarah had become a quiet ally. They began meeting after class, discussing ideas, talking about the philosophy they were studying and the ways they saw the world differently. Despite her reserved nature, Sarah had become a source of strength for Darius. Her calm, intellectual demeanor balanced out his more fiery responses. Together, they started formulating a plan to bring more real-world experiences into their discussions, challenging the ivory tower approach Halpern embodied. But with each passing day, Darius felt that there was something more at play, something deeper in Halpern's behavior than simple academic rivalry. It wasn't just the class or the curriculum that seemed to provoke such a strong reaction from the professor. No, there was something personal in the way Halpern had taken offense to Darius's presence. Something that ran beneath the surface, far beyond the confines of the classroom. It wasn't until one late afternoon, a week before midterms, that Darius finally stumbled upon something that seemed to make sense of the tension. He had stayed late in the library, buried in research for his next paper on Nietzsche's concept of the will to power. As he made his way out of the library, carrying a stack of books, he noticed Professor Halpern standing near the entrance, talking to a colleague. Their voices were low, too low for Darius to make out the words, but what he could hear sounded like Halpern's unmistakable tone, sharp, controlled, and deeply agitated. He considered walking past without making his presence known, but something stopped him. A gut feeling, the same kind of feeling that had urged him to speak up in class, urged him now to stay. There was something about this conversation that felt off. He stepped closer to the door, just enough to catch snippets of the exchange. He's too vocal about things he doesn't understand, Halpern's voice rang out clearly, though still controlled. The colleague, a middle-aged man with graying hair, responded, "You know what he's after. It's not just philosophy with him, Richard. It's a bigger agenda. You know what this could mean, don't you?" Darius's heart rate quickened. The words, "bigger agenda," felt loaded, like a secret that was being spoken in the open but veiled enough to keep it from being fully revealed. The colleague's voice dropped lower as Halpern responded, but Darius could catch only fragments. "I just don't think we're ready for this kind of confrontation." "He doesn't know the history." Halpern's words trailed off, the rest drowned in the murmur of their conversation. Darius's mind raced. What was he not understanding? What history were they referring to? His presence had obviously gotten under Halpern's skin, but he never imagined it would lead to something like this. He lingered by the door, unsure whether to approach or retreat. He needed answers. Answers that seemed so close, yet just out of reach. The professor's colleague left shortly after, and Halpern remained standing alone, his back to the door. Darius's mind was in overdrive, his thoughts spinning, but the one thing that stood out above everything else was the unmistakable tone of fear in Halpern's voice. Fear about him. And fear about something Darius didn't understand yet. It wasn't until the following day that Darius found the courage to confront him. The lecture hall was almost empty after class ended, the usual hum of student chatter reduced to murmurs as everyone packed their things. Darius walked up to Halpern's desk, a knot tightening in his stomach. He had no idea how the professor would react to this, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the moment for confrontation had arrived. "Professor Halpern," Darius said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. Halpern looked up from the papers he was grading, an expression of surprise flashing across his face. "Miles," he said, his tone cool but tinged with something else. "What can I do for you?" "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation yesterday," Darius began cautiously, his eyes fixed on the professor's face, searching for any sign of acknowledgement. "You and your colleague seem to be discussing something personal. Something about me. Something about my agenda." "What did you mean by that?" For a moment, Halpern didn't respond, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though he was calculating whether or not to dismiss Darius's inquiry. But then, after a long pause, Halpern sighed, looking away. "You overheard that, did you?" His voice had softened, though it still carried an edge of something unspoken. "I'm not sure that's something I should explain to you, Miles." Darius's frustration mounted, but he didn't let it show. "Then why did you say it? If it's nothing, why bring it up?" The professor shifted in his chair, his eyes briefly glancing over the papers on his desk as if looking for some excuse not to engage. But then, Halpern finally spoke, his voice quieter now, almost vulnerable. "It's not that simple, Darius. This isn't just about your views or your work. It's about something else. Something from the past." Darius's curiosity grew sharper. He leaned in slightly, sensing that he was on the verge of learning something important. "What past? What are you talking about?" Halpern's face remained unreadable, but the walls around him seemed to crack ever so slightly. "There's a history here, one that doesn't belong in the classroom. Something I've been trying to keep buried for years." Darius's mind raced. He was getting closer. He could feel it. But before he could press further, Halpern stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I think you should go now, Darius," he said, his voice now cold again. "We'll discuss this another time." Darius stood there, frozen for a moment, watching Halpern retreat into his thoughts. The truth was out there. Whatever it was hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. And Darius was determined to find it, no matter the cost. As he walked out of the classroom, the weight of the conversation hung over him. There was more to this battle than philosophy, than lectures and theories. There was a personal story here, a story that would change everything if Darius could just piece it together. The air felt heavier in the days that followed Darius's confrontation with Professor Halpern. The professor's words, spoken so quietly, yet with such weight, lingered in Darius's mind. There's a history here, one that doesn't belong in the classroom. Something I've been trying to keep buried for years. It was almost as if Halpern had opened a door, just enough for Darius to glimpse something dangerous and elusive behind it, but then quickly slammed it shut. Darius couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't just about his academic performance or his challenge to Halpern's ideas. No, this was personal. And if there was one thing Darius had learned from the streets and the world he grew up in, it was that personal battles ran deeper than any textbook could ever explain. They were tied to something raw, something real, and they never stayed buried forever. Days passed in a blur, and Darius found himself more distracted than ever, his focus wavering in class as he tried to piece together the fragments of what he had overheard. Even Sarah noticed the change in him. The normally composed, thoughtful Darius had become restless, quieter, more withdrawn. She had been worried about him ever since he had shared the brief exchange with her, but she had never seen him so consumed by it. "You've got that look again," Sarah said one afternoon, as they sat in the library, textbooks open but untouched. "That look like you're a million miles away. Talk to me, Darius. What's going on?" Darius hesitated, his fingers tapping the side of his book absent-mindedly. He could feel the pressure building inside him, the weight of his curiosity and the growing sense that something was about to crack. "It's Professor Halpern," he said finally, his voice low. "I overheard something the other day. Something personal. I don't think it's just about the class anymore, Sarah. There's something else going on with him." Sarah arched an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "Personal? Like what?" Darius leaned in closer, lowering his voice even more. "He said there's a history. Something buried. And I don't think it's just about me challenging him in class. There's something more to it. Something bigger." Sarah frowned, clearly puzzled. "A history? What could that mean? Is it related to his past or something? Could it be racial? You know how some of these professors are. Maybe he's got some biases, some things he doesn't want to confront." Darius nodded slowly, but he wasn't entirely convinced. "It's not just that." The way he said it, it was like he was afraid. Like whatever it is, it could ruin him if it ever came out. "And that's what makes me think it's deeper than just me or my grades. It's personal. Very personal." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, chewing on her lower lip. "Well, whatever it is, you can't let it eat you up. If he's hiding something, you don't have to carry that burden alone. Maybe it's time we get to the bottom of it." Darius glanced at Sarah, surprised by her resolve. He hadn't realized how much she had come to care about this situation. But hearing her words made him realize that, just maybe, he wasn't the only one fighting this battle. Later that night, Darius couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, his mind racing, turning over every possible scenario, every possible clue, but still coming up with more questions than answers. Why was Halpern so afraid of whatever he was hiding? And what did it have to do with Darius? The next day, Darius made a decision. He wasn't going to wait around for the professor to slip up again. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to let Halpern's games, or the fear that had settled over him, keep him from getting them. But Darius knew one thing: if he was going to confront Halpern again, he needed to be prepared. He started doing some digging into Halpern's background. It wasn't much, just a few old academic papers and public records, but Darius wasn't after professional accolades. He needed something more personal. Something that could explain Halpern's fear. Darius's phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, her words sharp and urgent. "I found something. Meet me at the library." His heart raced as he read the text. Darius grabbed his jacket and headed out the door without a second thought. When he arrived at the library, Sarah was already waiting at a corner table, her laptop open, her eyes scanning over something that made her frown deeply. "Check this out," she said, gesturing for him to sit down. She pulled up an article on her screen, an old news story from several years ago. The headline caught his attention immediately: Professor Richard Halpern involved in racial discrimination lawsuit, university settles out of court. Darius's stomach tightened as he read the article, his eyes scanning the details. The story recounted a lawsuit filed by a group of minority students who accused Halpern of discrimination during his time as a junior faculty member at another university. The case had been settled quietly, with the university paying a large sum of money to avoid a public trial. There were no further details, but the implication was clear. Halpern had been involved in something that had nearly destroyed his career. "That's why he's afraid," Darius murmured, more to himself than to Sarah. "It's not just about me or my ideas. It's about the fact that he's hiding a past he doesn't want anyone to know about." Sarah nodded grimly. "Exactly. He's terrified that if anyone finds out, it'll ruin him completely. He's trying to keep all of that buried. And you're not the only one who's been affected by it. There are other students who've had issues with him over the years, students who were silenced, too scared to speak up because of his power." Darius's mind was spinning. Halpern wasn't just a professor with a strong personality, he was a man carrying a dangerous secret, a secret that had the potential to destroy his career and, possibly, his reputation forever. But it wasn't just Halpern who needed to be exposed. It was the system that allowed someone like him to continue teaching, despite his history. Darius realized that this wasn't just about him or about Halpern anymore. It was about something much larger. "This changes everything," Darius said, his voice filled with a mix of anger and resolve. "We have to do something about this. We can't just let him keep getting away with it." Sarah met his gaze, her eyes serious and determined. "Then it's time to fight back. Together." The weight of their mission hung between them, heavier than ever before. But Darius knew one thing for sure now: they were no longer just students in Halpern's classroom. They were fighters in a much bigger battle. And they weren't going to back down. The following days were a blur of planning, research, and constant vigilance. Darius couldn't focus on anything else, he couldn't afford to. His world had narrowed to one singular mission: uncovering the full extent of Professor Halpern's past and exposing it to the world. The weight of the secret they'd uncovered was like a ticking time bomb, and the longer they kept it hidden, the more dangerous it felt. Darius and Sarah had continued their research in the library, combing through archives of old court documents, news stories, and anything they could find related to Halpern's past. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. The lawsuit had been settled quietly, but the whispers in the academic community were loud enough. Halpern's reputation had been damaged, but not enough to force him out of the academic world. And now, years later, it seemed like he was trying to bury it deep enough that no one would ever find out. Sarah was relentless. She managed to find records from the university where the lawsuit had taken place, documents that mentioned Halpern's involvement but had been redacted from the public eye. Darius had no doubt that they were walking on dangerous ground now. If they pushed any further, they might be exposing not just Halpern, but also the systems that had allowed him to keep his position despite his past. One afternoon, after another long day of searching, Sarah finally came to him with the news he had been waiting for. She had found something critical, a piece of evidence that could be the key to everything. She pulled up an email thread on her laptop, a series of exchanges between faculty members and the university's administration. The subject line read, "Confidential, Action Plan for Professor Halpern's Continued Employment." Darius leaned over the laptop, his pulse quickening. The emails were dated shortly after the lawsuit had been settled. In the messages, senior faculty members discussed how best to protect the reputation of Halpern and suggested strategies to keep the details of the lawsuit out of the public eye. The most damning line came from an administrator who said, "We must ensure that no one finds out about the history behind the lawsuit. Halpern is an asset to the department, and we cannot risk losing him to scandal." Darius stared at the screen, his mind racing. The university had knowingly protected Halpern, allowing him to continue teaching despite his past. And now, Halpern was trying to keep it buried, not just from his colleagues, but from the very students who sat in his lectures, unaware of the darker side of the man standing before them. "That's it," Darius said quietly, his voice a mix of anger and disbelief. "This is the smoking gun. The university is complicit in keeping his past a secret. They protected him. And that's what he's afraid of people finding out." Sarah nodded, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through the rest of the emails. This is more than just a professor's hidden past. It's a cover-up. And if this gets out, it could shake the entire department, maybe even the whole university. But if we go public with this, Darius, there's no going back. We'll be taking on more than just him. Darius looked at her, his eyes steely with resolve. He had known from the start that the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. But now, it felt more personal than ever. This wasn't just about exposing Halpern, it was about exposing a system that allowed corruption and silence to thrive. He wasn't going to stand by and let it continue. "We don't have a choice," Darius said firmly. "We can't let him get away with it. Not after everything he's done to students, to people like us who have no voice in the system. This is bigger than Halpern now." Sarah sighed, her expression serious. "So, what's the plan?" Darius leaned back in his chair, his mind working quickly, calculating their next move. They had the evidence now, and they knew the risks. The university would do everything in its power to suppress the truth, just as it had done with Halpern's past. But they couldn't back down. "We need to get this information to the right people. We can't do this alone. If we go public, we'll need support, and we need to make sure the university can't just sweep it under the rug again." Sarah nodded, her gaze unwavering. "We'll need allies. People who won't back down, no matter what. We have to be strategic." Darius's mind was already racing. They would need to go beyond just the faculty. This had to be a public matter, a scandal that couldn't be ignored. The students had to know. The community had to know. They had to ensure that Halpern's past, and the university's role in protecting him, could never be buried again. "I'm going to talk to a few people," Darius said, standing up from the table. "We can't do this without their help." Sarah gave him a nod of agreement, but she hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Are you sure you're ready for this? Once it's out, it can't be taken back." Darius looked at her, his expression resolute. "I'm sure. I've spent my whole life fighting for a chance to be heard. This is just one more fight. And this time, I'm not backing down." That afternoon, Darius began his mission to gather support. He reached out to several trusted students who had either voiced their discontent with Halpern's teaching style or had witnessed his biases firsthand. Slowly, he pieced together a small group, a group of students who, like him, were tired of remaining silent. They met in secret, planning their next moves with calculated precision. Darius knew they couldn't go straight to the press yet. First, they needed to make sure they had every piece of the puzzle. They needed witnesses, students who had experienced Halpern's discrimination firsthand and could speak up. They needed to make sure that the public would see the full scope of what had happened, not just a series of legal settlements, but the lives affected by Halpern's actions. The pressure was mounting. Darius could feel it in his chest, the urgency of what they were about to do. But he couldn't stop now. The truth was bigger than his fear. It was bigger than Halpern's attempt to bury it all. And Darius was determined to make sure it came to light. The weight of the plan was settling into Darius's bones. It wasn't just the burden of the truth, they had discovered things that could unravel not just Halpern's life, but the very structure that had shielded him. They weren't just fighting for justice, they were preparing to tear down a system that had existed for years. And no matter how they looked at it, that came with consequences. After several days of clandestine meetings, Darius had assembled a small but determined group of students, each of them had witnessed or been affected by Halpern's actions. Some had been his students in past semesters, others had heard rumors, and a few had even tried to confront him directly. But all of them had been silenced one way or another, either through subtle intimidation or the fear of retaliation in their grades or reputation. It was time to act. Their first step was to gather the evidence and present it in a way that could not be dismissed. They couldn't afford to be hasty or sloppy, this had to be precise, calculated, and undeniable. "All right," Darius said as they sat in a dimly lit conference room on campus, their laptops open, the air thick with tension. "We've got the proof. Now we need to get it into the right hands." Sarah was sitting next to him, her brow furrowed as she scrolled through the documents on her laptop. "We've got the lawsuit records, the emails. Now we need testimonies from students who were directly impacted. The university can't ignore this if it's coming from multiple people." The others in the group nodded in agreement, though the nervous energy was palpable. There was a quiet sense of fear in the room, the kind of fear that comes with challenging a power that has always been untouchable. They were about to face an institution, a machine that had been around long before they were born, and they were going to try and tear it down with nothing but their voices and their courage. Darius met each of their eyes. "We're not just exposing Halpern. We're exposing the system that protected him. This is about more than just us. It's about the future, about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." "Then let's make sure we do it right," Sarah said, her voice steady. "Let's get our stories straight. We're not going to back down." Darius stood, his resolve solidifying. "First, we go to the press. We get them to investigate, make it public. We need the whole university community to know what's been happening behind the scenes. After that, we'll hit them with the rest, the records, the testimonies. If the press starts asking questions, the university will have no choice but to respond." The team set to work. Some reached out to student newspapers, others tried to make connections with local reporters who had covered past university scandals. The key, they all knew, was to make sure they weren't seen as just a handful of disgruntled students. This had to be about the truth, and the truth had to be undeniable. By the end of the week, they had a story. It wasn't just one-sided. They had statements from students, copies of the emails, and a solid link to the lawsuit that had been quietly buried years ago. It wasn't enough to go full-blown public yet, but it was enough to get the press interested. Darius knew that if they timed it right, they could hit the university before they had a chance to mount any defense. As the day approached for their first strike, the tension in the group was palpable. Everyone was nervous, unsure of the consequences, yet all of them were unified in their goal, to expose the truth. They sat together in Sarah's dorm room late into the night, reading over everything one last time. The clock was ticking down, and Darius could feel the weight of what they were about to do. If they succeeded, they could change everything. But if they failed, if the university fought back too hard, it would all fall apart. The phone call came early the next morning. Darius was half asleep, his phone buzzing on the nightstand. He reached for it groggily, still processing the events of the night before. It was Sarah. "They're asking questions," she said breathlessly when Darius answered. "The reporter, she wants to meet. She's got her editor's approval, and they're ready to run the story." Darius's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment they'd been working for. "All right," he said, sitting up, adrenaline flooding through him. "Let's make sure we've got everything. If we're doing this, we do it right." By the time they met the reporter that afternoon, the small team had gathered at least half a dozen student testimonies, including one from a student who had been directly harassed by Halpern in the classroom. They had copies of the emails from the university administration, and they had Halpern's previous disciplinary record, everything lined up, airtight. The reporter, a woman in her 30s named Rachel, was sharp, her eyes scanning the documents with professional detachment. Darius felt a moment of hesitation as she glanced up at him. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice calm but probing. "This is a big step. Going public with this could lead to backlash, for you and for the students who are involved." "I'm sure," Darius said firmly. "We've been silent for too long. Now it's time for the truth to come out. Rachel nodded and turned back to her notes. We'll publish this first thing tomorrow. You'll be quoted, along with the other students who've spoken up. But after this, after it's out, there's no going back. Be ready. As they walked out of the cafe where the meeting had taken place, Darius couldn't help but feel a surge of adrenaline. It was happening. The first step toward exposing Halpern and the system that protected him was in motion. But as the sun began to set that evening, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the precipice of something far bigger than they realized. The university wouldn't go down without a fight. And Halpern, the man who had tried to destroy him so many times, would surely strike back with everything he had. The calm before the storm was over. The first hint of trouble came the following morning, just as Darius had expected. The story hit the press like a wave crashing into the shore, pulling everything in its path into chaos. The campus was abuzz. Students gathered in clusters, whispering, their phones out, checking the headlines and reading the explosive article that Rachel had written. Halpern's name, long shielded by the walls of academia, was now in the public eye, linked to a past so dark that it shook the foundation of the institution. Darius could hardly believe it. He had been waiting for this moment, for the world to know what they had uncovered. But the reality of it, the immediate rush of media attention, was overwhelming. His phone buzzed non-stop with texts, calls, and messages from students and friends who were either congratulating him or expressing disbelief over the story. One of the first texts came from Sarah. It's out. People are freaking out. Are you ready for this? He quickly typed back, the anticipation almost unbearable. We don't have a choice now. We're in this together. Let's stay focused. As the day went on, the pressure began to mount. The university had no choice but to respond. By midday, a formal statement from the administration was released. The words were carefully crafted, designed to deflect responsibility and downplay the severity of the situation. The statement acknowledged the serious allegations, but claimed that Halpern had since addressed the situation and was fully committed to the university's academic and ethical standards. Darius scoffed when he read it. The message was clear: the university was trying to protect its own, offering a smooth, scripted response that ignored the truth. But then, just as he was preparing to discuss next steps with the group, something unexpected happened. His phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was local. With a deep breath, Darius answered. Darius? A voice, strained but familiar, crackled through the speaker. His heart skipped. It was Rachel, the reporter. Darius, I don't know how to say this, she said, her voice laced with tension. I've been contacted by the university. They're pressuring me to pull the story. They're offering me a massive donation to the newsroom in exchange for retraction. They said that if the story doesn't get pulled, they'll go public with everything they know about me. My personal life, the sources I've used in the past, everything. They're trying to scare me into submission. Darius froze. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but hearing it like this, directly from Rachel, made it all the more real. The university wasn't going to just sit back and let the story run its course. They were going to fight back with everything they had. What are you going to do? Darius asked, his voice low, fighting the growing panic inside. I'm not backing down, Rachel said firmly. But I need your help. This is bigger than me. They're going to come after all of you, too. The pressure is mounting, and it's only going to get worse. Darius could hear the crackling tension in the silence that followed her words. He knew the moment they'd been waiting for had arrived. This was the beginning of the real fight. I won't back down either, Darius said. We've come too far to quit now. The truth is out there, and I won't let them silence us. Rachel's relief was palpable. Good. Stay strong, Darius. The press is already picking up on the story. It's bigger than just our school now. But I'm telling you, they will escalate this. And when they do, you need to be ready. Before he could respond, she hung up, leaving him with a sense of both dread and determination. The storm had broken. They had fired the first shot, but now the university would unleash all its power to try and quash them. Darius called an emergency meeting with the group. When they all gathered in Sarah's dorm room, the tension was thick. Everyone had already heard the rumors. There was talk of Halpern being put on administrative leave, of the university offering hush money, of attempts to discredit the reporters and the students involved. Sarah stood up first, her face pale. "They're going to fight dirty," she said. "They're going to try to intimidate us. I can feel it." Darius nodded grimly. "They're already starting. But we can't let them win. This is our moment. We've got the truth. They can't hide from that." There was a long silence as everyone processed the gravity of the situation. No one spoke, but the unspoken understanding was clear: this wasn't just about exposing a corrupt professor anymore. This was a battle for their futures, for their voices, for the rights of every student who had been made to feel small, insignificant, or invisible. One of the students, Ethan, finally spoke up. His voice was shaking, but his words carried weight. "We've got to go public with more. The administration is trying to sweep this under the rug with that statement. If we don't keep pushing, if we don't show people what's really going on, they'll never change. We've got to stay visible. We need to be loud." Darius stood and paced the room, thinking through their options. "You're right. We've already made the first strike. But we need to keep the pressure on. We'll do a press conference, get our voices heard outside of just the story. We need to be seen. We need people to see that this isn't just about Halpern, this is about a broken system that allows corruption to fester." The group nodded in agreement. It was risky, there was no doubt about that. A press conference would draw even more attention, and they knew the university would retaliate in some way. But they couldn't stop now. The stakes were too high. They began planning immediately, each person taking on a role. Some of them worked on gathering additional evidence, others reached out to sympathetic professors who could potentially lend their support, and a few focused on organizing logistics for the conference. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The media attention escalated, with stories spreading beyond just the student papers and local news outlets. Social media was flooded with posts from students demanding accountability, from alumni expressing their anger over the university's failure to address its own corruption, and from activists supporting the push for justice. The university responded with a counter-campaign, trying to paint Darius and his group as troublemakers, trying to delegitimize their claims by questioning their motives. But every attack only made Darius more resolute. Finally, the day of the press conference arrived. Darius stood in front of a group of reporters, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, the weight of the truth and the responsibility he carried. "This isn't just about one man," Darius began, his voice steady but powerful. "This is about every student who has been dismissed, ignored, or silenced. This is about accountability. We won't let the university or anyone else cover up the truth any longer." The storm was breaking wide open now, and Darius knew that there was no turning back. The press conference had sent ripples through the campus, but Darius knew that it wasn't enough. The storm had broken, but the worst was yet to come. The university had already started to shift gears, using every tool at its disposal to crush the uprising. The administration was scrambling to contain the damage, and Darius and his team were right in the center of it all. The aftermath of the press conference was a whirlwind. The university's PR team worked overtime to control the narrative. The chancellor released a statement distancing the university from the allegations, stating that they would conduct a thorough investigation into the matter. But to Darius, it was nothing more than a strategic delay tactic. The truth was already out, and it was too late to put the toothpaste back in the tube. The university's lawyers called him in for the first time the very next day. Darius sat in the small, cold conference room, his palms sweating as the door opened, revealing two attorneys in dark suits. The older one, a man in his 50s, carried an air of quiet authority. He introduced himself as Alan Hayes, senior counsel for the university, and the younger one, a woman in her 30s named Megan Clark, sat down opposite him, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Mr. Miles," Hayes began, his voice calm but firm, "we appreciate your cooperation in this matter, but I'm sure you understand that the university takes these allegations very seriously." Darius leaned forward in his chair, meeting their gaze, refusing to show any sign of weakness. "I'm sure you do. That's why I'm here, right? To help with your thorough investigation." Clark's lips curled into a slight smile, but it was clear she wasn't here to be friendly. "We just want to make sure that all of this is handled properly. The allegations you've made are severe, and there are a lot of people involved. Your actions have already caused a significant disruption. I'm sure you're aware that the university could seek legal action if the situation continues to escalate." Darius's heart beat faster. He'd expected the threats, he knew the game they were playing. They were trying to intimidate him, to scare him into backing down. But he couldn't afford to flinch now. This wasn't about just him anymore, this was about every student who had been mistreated or silenced. "You think I'm scared of a lawsuit?" Darius said, his voice low but unwavering. "You're wasting your time. The truth is out, and there's no putting it back in." Hayes exchanged a look with Clark, then turned back to Darius. "You have to understand, Mr. Miles, that the university's reputation is at stake here. People trust us. Students trust us. Your actions have the potential to destroy years of hard work." Darius couldn't help but laugh. Years of hard work spent protecting predators like Halpern? Yeah, maybe. But that's not my problem anymore. The truth is, you can't erase what's already been uncovered. Clark shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing. "We'll see about that. The university has resources. You might be able to fool a few reporters, but you'll find that fighting a whole institution isn't as easy as you think." With that, they stood up and left, their threat lingering in the air. Darius knew they weren't done. They would pull every string, throw every accusation at him, and try to paint him as the villain. But he couldn't back down. He wouldn't. Not now, not after everything they had uncovered. The days that followed were filled with more threats and intimidation tactics. The university's lawyers sent letters to the other students involved, warning them about the potential legal consequences. Some of the professors who had shown their support began to distance themselves. Darius could feel the pressure mounting. It was becoming a battle on multiple fronts. But Darius wasn't alone in this. Sarah, Ethan, and the rest of the team stood firm. They met in secret every night, strategizing their next move, finding ways to stay one step ahead of the administration. The media was still on their side, but the university was making moves to discredit them. It wasn't just about the story anymore, it was about survival. Sarah called one night, her voice filled with urgency. "Darius, the administration is putting out rumors. They're trying to say that we've been misrepresenting the truth, that the evidence we presented is fabricated. They're even suggesting that you're being manipulated by outside forces, that you're acting out of revenge." Darius felt his blood run cold. The university was starting to plant seeds of doubt, trying to turn the public against them. If people started questioning the integrity of the group, the whole movement could fall apart. "They're trying to isolate us," Darius said, pacing the room as he spoke. "If we let them get away with it, they'll win. We can't let them control the narrative." "I know," Sarah replied. "But we can't fight a war on all fronts. We need to find the biggest piece of evidence we have and throw it back in their faces. We need something undeniable." Darius sat down, the weight of their situation pressing heavily on his shoulders. He thought back to the records they had dug up, the lawsuit, the emails, the testimonies. But there was one thing they hadn't fully explored yet, one piece of the puzzle that could bring it all crashing down. "The secret meetings," he said slowly. Halpern's meetings with the administration, where they made decisions about how to cover up his actions. We need those minutes. If we can get them, it's game over. The next few days became a blur of strategizing, reaching out to sources within the administration, and trying to find any trace of these hidden meetings. But the university had grown increasingly paranoid. Every email was scrutinized, every conversation monitored. They were making it impossible for Darius and his team to move freely. Then, finally, they caught a break. Ethan managed to get a tip from a friend in the administration who had access to some of the private records. He confirmed that there were indeed meetings, multiple meetings, that had been kept out of the public eye. These were meetings where the university had decided how to handle Halpern's misdeeds and, in some cases, how to minimize the damage. The evidence was there. It wasn't just about Halpern anymore, it was about a systematic attempt to protect powerful people, no matter the cost. As they prepared to go public with this new information, Darius realized that the fight was no longer just about one corrupt professor. It was about the entire system, the machine that allowed people like Halpern to thrive while crushing those who dared to challenge them. But as the storm continued to break, Darius knew that every action they took would lead to an even bigger confrontation. And no matter what, they couldn't stop now. The truth was in their hands, and it was going to change everything. The news hit the campus like a bombshell. Darius, Sarah, and the rest of the group had managed to get their hands on the smoking gun, the confidential meeting minutes. Documents detailing how the university had known about Professor Halpern's actions for years and had actively worked to suppress the truth were now in the hands of the student body. The administration's carefully crafted narrative, the one they tried to spin in their press statements and behind closed doors, was completely shattered. The minutes revealed that Halpern's misconduct wasn't an isolated incident. It was systemic. The university had been protecting a predator, choosing to shield its reputation over the safety and well-being of its students. In the most damning part of the document, there was a clear directive: mitigate the fallout and protect key personnel. Ensure any potential victims are silenced. Darius sat with the group in their now familiar meeting spot, Sarah's dorm room. He felt the weight of the documents in his hands. This was it. This was the evidence that could change everything. But at the same time, a sense of dread gnawed at him. They were walking a tightrope. The university had already shown its willingness to go to extreme lengths to protect itself. What would it do now that it was cornered? We need to release this, Sarah said, her voice steady but tinged with the kind of nervous energy that only comes with being on the precipice of something huge. We need to show the world exactly what's been happening behind closed doors. Darius nodded, but his mind raced. He knew that releasing this evidence would be the final straw. The university would have no choice but to respond, and he feared what lengths they would go to in order to protect themselves. They had already tried to discredit them, now, they would try to destroy them. I agree, Darius said. But we have to be smart about it. If we just dump these documents out there without a plan, it could backfire. We need to give it the weight it deserves. The group sat in silence for a moment, understanding the gravity of the situation. They couldn't afford any missteps now. They had spent months digging, gathering information, and risking everything to get to this point. They weren't just exposing a corrupt professor anymore, they were exposing a broken system. I think we should go public through the media, Ethan suggested, his voice calm despite the tension in the room. We have the contacts. If we release it to the press, it'll be harder for the university to spin it as a smear campaign. This needs to be seen as a legitimate expose, not just a bunch of students stirring up trouble. It was a good idea. The press had been on their side since the beginning, and if they presented the documents alongside a well-crafted narrative, they might be able to shift the tide in their favor. The university's defenses would crumble once this information hit the mainstream. But as the group prepared to take the next step, they began to feel the full weight of what was at stake. The media had already begun covering the story from every angle, but now the stakes were even higher. The administration would see this as an all-out attack, and Darius knew they wouldn't go down without a fight. The tension mounted throughout the day as they made final preparations. The pressure of the situation seemed to cloud every thought, and Darius couldn't help but feel the exhaustion creeping in. Every decision, every move they made, felt like it could tip the scales either way. One wrong step, and they could lose everything they had worked so hard to uncover. As evening approached, Darius received a message. It was from Rachel, the reporter who had first taken an interest in their story. The university's response is coming soon. They've already drafted a counter-story. They're accusing you all of fabricating evidence. They're even going to claim that you've been in contact with outside forces, trying to push an agenda. Be ready. They'll come after you hard. Darius ran a hand through his hair, frustration welling up inside him. They had been expecting this. The university would stop at nothing to protect its reputation, even if it meant destroying the very students it claimed to support. Darius, are you okay? Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. He hadn't realized how much time had passed since Rachel's message had arrived. The entire group was standing in front of him, waiting for his decision. He took a deep breath, his mind clear for the first time all day. We're ready. We can't let them control the narrative anymore. This is our moment to finally expose the truth. We're not backing down. Sarah gave him a small, reassuring smile. We're with you. Always. With the group's support, Darius took a moment to reflect. This was it. The tipping point. Once they released these documents, the game would change forever. The university would have to either respond in full force or collapse under the weight of the truth. Either way, there was no going back. By the time night fell, they were ready. Ethan had already made contact with Rachel, and the press conference was scheduled. It would be live-streamed, giving them a global audience. This wasn't just about their campus anymore. This was about justice, accountability, and fighting back against an institution that thought it could hide its sins. Darius's hands shook as he hit send on the final draft of their statement, attaching the incriminating documents. The story was officially out of their hands now. All they could do was wait. The silence that followed was deafening. The minutes felt like hours as they watched the live feed, waiting for the first news outlet to break the story. When the first notification popped up on their phones, it felt like the world had shifted beneath them. Breaking, University in hot water as secret meeting minutes expose pattern of corruption and cover-up in the Halpern case. Investigation reveals shocking details about university's role in protecting alleged predator. A mixture of relief and anxiety washed over Darius. They had done it. The truth was out there, and the world would now see the university for what it truly was. But even as the floodgates opened and the media coverage intensified, Darius knew that this was just the beginning. The university would retaliate, and the fight would only grow more intense. He was prepared for it. He had no choice. The fight was on. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The morning after the press release, Darius could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. The campus was alive with murmurs, and yet, for all the noise, there was an overwhelming sense of stillness. He had expected a sense of triumph, but instead, it felt like everything was about to unravel. The university's response was swift. A press conference had been scheduled before noon, and the chancellor was already making waves, trying to shift the narrative. They were not just denying the allegations, they were aggressively fighting back. The statement issued by the university was filled with strong language about malicious misinformation, fabricated evidence, and baseless accusations. The administration portrayed Darius and his group as radical agitators with no regard for the truth. It was clear that the university would not let this go quietly. The chancellor emphasized that they were committed to a full investigation, but it was obvious to everyone watching that this was just another delay tactic, designed to buy time. The damage control was in full swing. They were trying to paint Darius as a troublemaker, an opportunist, someone who was looking to bring down the university for personal gain. In the hours that followed, the media erupted with reactions. Some outlets sided with the university, running stories that echoed the administration's claims. They called Darius's actions reckless, warning that the students involved in the protest could be severely punished. But other outlets were less sympathetic. The story was gaining traction, and slowly, people were beginning to understand the depth of the corruption at play. But the backlash was immediate and intense. On social media, the hashtags #JusticeForDarius and #UniversityCoverup began to trend. While some students rallied behind him, others started to distance themselves, afraid of being caught in the middle of a battle that was bigger than they had ever imagined. Darius's phone was constantly buzzing. News outlets wanted interviews. Supporters were reaching out with words of encouragement. But there was also the other side of the coin, threatening messages from strangers, and more ominously, the silence from people he thought he could count on. Professors, students, and even friends who had previously supported him were now cautious, hesitant to get involved. They had seen what the university could do when it felt threatened, and now they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't stay neutral. At one point, Darius received a call from his mother. The concern in her voice was palpable, even though she tried to mask it. "Darius, this is getting too big. I know you're fighting for what's right, but, be careful. The university is a powerful place, and they have more resources than you can imagine. Please, think about what you're doing." Her words stung, but he knew she was only worried about him. She hadn't seen the things he had seen, felt the things he had felt. She hadn't lived through the kind of corruption that could hide behind glossy brochures and press releases. Darius wasn't sure if he would make it through this fight, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't walk away. Not now. As the day wore on, Darius and his team huddled together in the quiet of their meeting spot. They had expected a fight, but the university's response was more vicious than any of them had anticipated. The administration had taken the gloves off, and they were ready to crush any hope of a real investigation. "We have to keep pushing," Sarah said, her voice sharp. "We can't let them silence us. The truth is out there, and now the world is watching. This is just the beginning." Ethan nodded in agreement. "We need to find a way to hit them even harder. We can't let this turn into a back and forth. We need to take control of the narrative." But Darius knew they couldn't just keep pushing. This was bigger than them. The university had an army of lawyers, media experts, and PR professionals, all working tirelessly to undermine their credibility. But what they had was something far more valuable: the truth. "I think it's time we go beyond just the press," Darius said, his voice firm. "We need to get the student body involved. We've already shown the world what's happening behind the scenes, but now it's time for the students to stand up." They had been relying on the media, but Darius realized that what they needed was mass mobilization. They had to show the university that this wasn't just about a few students, but about the entire student body. If they could get people to march, to protest, to speak out, it would be impossible for the administration to ignore them. The decision was made. Darius and his team began organizing a campus-wide protest. They would rally the students, get them out into the open, and flood the administration with demands for accountability. It was going to be risky. The university was sure to retaliate, but this was their moment. They couldn't waste it. As the hours passed, the plan came together. Flyers were printed. Social media posts went live. The university had made its move, and now it was their turn to respond. The rally was scheduled for the following afternoon, and Darius felt a surge of adrenaline as he thought about what was to come. The protest would be the tipping point. The next day, as students began to gather on the campus quad, a sense of anticipation filled the air. What had started as a small group of angry students had grown into a full-scale movement. Hundreds of students stood in solidarity with Darius and his group, waving signs and chanting slogans. The energy was palpable, the air thick with defiance. Darius stood at the front of the crowd, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if this would be enough, but he knew they had no other choice. They had already exposed the truth. Now it was time to make sure the world couldn't look away. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw the university's security team moving in, their eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. Darius steeled himself, knowing the battle had just escalated to a new level. But the moment of tension was broken by a loud cheer from the crowd. One by one, students began to shout out, calling for justice. And in that moment, Darius knew they had won. They had found their voice, and now, no matter how hard the university tried to suppress them, they would never be silenced. The rally that had taken over the campus quad felt like a turning point. Darius had never seen so many students united in one cause. The energy was electric, but beneath the surface, there was a palpable sense of fear. The protest was not just about one corrupt professor anymore, it was about standing up against an institution that had chosen power over justice, silence over truth. Darius stood at the front of the crowd, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind raced with thoughts of the university's next move. The administration had already shown its willingness to fight dirty, but now, they had something bigger to contend with. The students were awake, and they were not backing down. At first, the rally was peaceful. Students marched, chanting slogans, holding signs that demanded justice for the victims of Professor Halpern and accountability from the university. But as the hours passed, it became clear that the administration wasn't going to let the protests slide. They had already sent in their security forces, and it was only a matter of time before the situation escalated. The tension in the air grew thick, like a storm was about to break. Darius could see the campus security team gathering, their eyes scanning the crowd, looking for any reason to start a confrontation. He knew they had been waiting for this moment, the moment when they could justify using force to break up the protest. It was exactly what the university wanted. They needed to discredit the movement, to show the public that the students were nothing more than a bunch of troublemakers. Darius's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his heart sinking as he saw the message from Sarah. "They're bringing in the police. They'll try to shut us down." The blood drained from his face. This was it. The university was going to use everything they had to stop them. But Darius wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for. He turned to the group of students standing next to him. "We can't let them intimidate us," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "We have the truth on our side. We've come this far, and we can't stop now. If they want to silence us, we'll make sure they hear us loud and clear." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising together in solidarity. Darius could feel the power of their unity, and for the first time in weeks, a sense of hope surged through him. He wasn't alone in this fight. The students were with him. They were ready to face whatever the university threw at them. But as the minutes ticked by, the situation grew more volatile. The police began to move in, forming a line in front of the protesters. The tension was palpable as the students stared down the officers, their hands raised in defiance, their chants growing louder. "Justice! Justice! Justice!" The words echoed through the quad, reverberating off the buildings, as though the campus itself was demanding justice. But the administration wasn't listening. Darius could see the grim expressions on the faces of the university's officials as they observed the protest from the sidelines. They had underestimated the strength of the student body, but now that it had grown to this magnitude, they were panicking. They couldn't afford for this to go viral. They couldn't afford for the world to see what was really happening on their campus. "Everyone, stay calm," Darius shouted, trying to maintain control of the situation. "We're here for justice, not for violence. Let them hear us, but let's keep our message clear. We're not backing down." Just then, a loud voice cut through the air. "Move along, or we'll arrest you." Darius's eyes locked with the officer at the front of the line. He could feel the surge of anger rising within him, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had seen this play before, the heavy-handed tactics used by institutions that didn't care about the people they were supposed to protect. The police weren't here to keep the peace. They were here to shut down the protest, to break the movement before it could gain more momentum. "Don't do it, Darius," a voice said beside him. It was Ethan, his face pale with concern. "We can't afford for this to get violent." But Darius wasn't thinking about the consequences right now. He was thinking about the victims. The women who had been silenced for so long, the students who had been forced to endure the university's corrupt practices, the families who had been affected by the lies. He couldn't let this moment slip away. "Stand your ground," Darius said quietly. "We've come this far. We're not going to let them erase our voices." The crowd was still chanting, but now, the police were moving forward, their riot gear gleaming under the harsh campus lights. The tension was thick, the air heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. Darius stood at the front, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for the inevitable. Then, in an unexpected twist, something incredible happened. A figure stepped forward from the crowd, someone Darius had not expected to see. It was Professor Linda Hargrove, the woman who had once been a supporter of the administration, the one who had chosen silence over speaking out. But now, as she walked toward Darius, her face was resolute, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm here to stand with you," she said, her voice strong. "You're right. This university needs to be held accountable." The crowd fell silent, the shock of her appearance rippling through the protesters. Professor Hargrove was not just any faculty member, she was an influential one. Her standing at the front of the protest sent a powerful message. If someone like her, someone who had been part of the establishment, was willing to risk everything for the truth, then maybe they had a real chance. The officers hesitated, unsure of how to respond. For the first time that night, Darius saw a crack in their resolve. The sight of a respected faculty member joining the protest was enough to give the students renewed strength. They weren't alone anymore. This wasn't just a student issue, it was a faculty issue. It was a moral issue. Darius turned to the crowd and raised his fist in the air. "This is our fight," he shouted. "We will not be silenced. Not now. Not ever." And in that moment, everything shifted. The energy in the crowd reached a new height, and the message was clear. This was no longer just about Darius. It was about everyone who had been victimized by the university's corruption. It was about everyone who had been silenced for far too long. The final stand had begun, and Darius knew that whatever happened next, they had already won. They had found their voice, and nothing could take that away. The moment Professor Hargrove stepped forward, everything changed. What had begun as a small spark of defiance in the face of injustice had now ignited into something far more powerful. The students rallied around her, the professors who had quietly supported them from the sidelines now stepping into the light. The administration had underestimated them, and now it was time to face the consequences. The press swarmed. The cameras rolled. Darius stood at the front of the crowd, his eyes locked on the officers who had been ready to shut them down. They hesitated now, unsure of how to handle the growing strength of the protest. The scene was surreal. Students and faculty members standing side by side, unified by a shared belief in the truth. No longer would they be pawns in the university's game. By the time the rally had spread to every corner of campus, Darius had become a symbol. His name was on the lips of students across the nation. From the protesters to the online commentators, his story had transcended the boundaries of just one university, it had become a reflection of the wider fight against institutional power and corruption. But with the increased media attention came the inevitable backlash. The university's administration went into overdrive, frantically attempting to control the damage. Lawyers were called in. Press releases were sent out, distancing the administration from the actions of Professor Halpern and claiming that the events surrounding the professor's actions had been exaggerated and misunderstood. Their narrative was clear: the students were disruptive, the media was complicit, and the university had nothing to answer for. Darius had seen this coming. They were trying to gaslight the world, hoping that if they spun enough lies, the truth would be buried. But this time, Darius wasn't backing down. The students weren't backing down. What had started as a whisper had become a roar that the university couldn't ignore. As he sat in the makeshift war room with his closest allies, Sarah, Ethan, and Professor Hargrove, they began strategizing the next move. The protests weren't enough anymore. They needed to hit the administration where it hurt, their credibility. "We need to dig deeper," Darius said, tapping his fingers against the table. "The university thinks they can silence us, but they don't know what we're capable of." Sarah nodded. "We've got enough evidence now. We need to leak it. It's the only way we'll break through." "I'm in," Ethan said, his eyes burning with determination. "We've already exposed Halpern's lies. It's time to show the world who the university really is." Professor Hargrove, who had quietly been observing the group, finally spoke. "The university won't go down without a fight. We need to be strategic. Leaking documents and confidential information could be dangerous, both for us and for the victims. We need something bigger. Something undeniable." Darius thought for a moment, his mind whirling. The weight of their choices was heavy, but they had no other option. If they didn't take bold action now, the university would bury them under its bureaucratic weight. "I've got it," he said, his voice steady with purpose. "We need to bring in the other victims. The ones who've been too afraid to speak out. They're the ones who can show the world just how far the university is willing to go to protect its reputation." The group fell silent. This was the next phase. It wasn't just about the students anymore. It wasn't just about Darius. It was about everyone who had been affected by the systemic corruption and abuse of power within the university. "We're going to organize a series of interviews," Darius continued, his mind racing with the plan. "We'll gather the testimonies of the victims. We'll let them tell their stories, without filters, without interference. No more half-truths. This is how we take down the administration." The plan was risky. It meant exposing vulnerable individuals, people who had been hurt by the system, and giving them a platform to speak out. But it also meant they would have the kind of undeniable proof that would make it impossible for the university to spin the narrative any longer. "Let's do it," Sarah said. "Let's bring the truth to light." With the plan set in motion, the team worked tirelessly to coordinate with the victims, ensuring that their testimonies were heard in full, without distortion. These weren't just students speaking out for the sake of protest, they were the people who had been harmed by the very institution they had trusted. They were the real victims, and their stories were going to be the final blow to the university's carefully crafted image. As Darius sat in front of his laptop, reviewing the footage of the first interview, a feeling of unease settled in his stomach. These were people he didn't know, people whose lives had been shattered by the university's actions. Their stories were raw, painful, and heartbreaking. But they were also the truth. And the truth had the power to change everything. The first interview was with Alicia, a graduate student who had come forward with her experience of being targeted by Professor Halpern. She spoke of the sexual harassment she had endured, the way Halpern had manipulated her and ruined her academic future. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but there was an undeniable strength in her words. This was her moment to be heard. "I was so afraid," Alicia said in the interview, her eyes brimming with tears. "Afraid of what would happen if I spoke out. Afraid of losing everything. But now I realize, I've lost everything already. The university protected him, and it silenced me. I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through." Darius felt his heart heavy as he watched her speak. Her pain was undeniable, and yet, in her courage, he saw the hope that had driven them all to this point. This wasn't just about one professor. This was about the entire system that had allowed this to happen, and now, they were ready to tear it down. The interviews continued, and the stories flowed. Each one was a heartbreaking testament to the power of the university's system of corruption. And as they accumulated, so did the pressure on the administration. The media began to pick up the interviews, running headlines that painted a damning picture of the university's practices. It was only a matter of time before the pressure became too much for the administration to handle. And that time was coming fast. It was the kind of moment Darius had been waiting for, dreading, yet anticipating. The weight of what they had uncovered was immense, and it was about to break free. The interviews had spread across every major news outlet. The university's administrators were scrambling, sending out a constant stream of press releases and holding emergency meetings to devise a strategy to discredit the growing chorus of voices. But it wasn't working anymore. The cracks in the facade had become too large to cover up. For the first time in his life, Darius felt like he wasn't just a student, he was a force to be reckoned with. The power had shifted, and the university's carefully constructed world was starting to crumble. "Did you see the latest headlines?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp with a mixture of triumph and disbelief as she barged into Darius's dorm room. She threw her phone on the desk in front of him, the screen displaying a headline from a major news outlet, "University Under Fire After Bombshell Allegations of Misconduct." Darius leaned in, his eyes scanning the article. His heart skipped a beat. The university's statement, which once could have easily silenced any opposition, was now being completely overshadowed by the growing list of students and faculty members who had come forward. This wasn't just about one professor anymore, this was about an entire institution built on corruption, power, and the silencing of those who dared speak out. "This is happening, Darius," Sarah said, almost in awe. "This is real. We've got them. The truth is out." For a moment, Darius sat back, the weight of the situation pressing on him. He could feel the momentum building, and while it was exhilarating, it was also terrifying. What would happen next? The students and faculty had united behind a cause, but would it be enough to bring the university to its knees? Just then, Ethan walked in, his face grim. "It's happening faster than we thought. They're calling in extra security. Word is, they're preparing to shut down the campus entirely, to try and contain this before it spreads further." Darius's stomach tightened. He had expected the university to fight back, but now, it was clear, they were desperate. When the university's power was threatened, it would stop at nothing to protect its interests. "We can't let them intimidate us," Darius said, standing up and pacing. "We've got to keep pushing forward. We've come too far to back down now." The weight of the next steps was enormous. They had already made it clear that they weren't backing down, but what was the next move? Darius knew the university would not let this slip away quietly. There was too much at stake for them to do anything but fight. "We need to take it to the next level," he said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We've got the media, we've got the testimony, but we need something undeniable. Something they can't ignore. We need to force them into a position where they have no choice but to act." Ethan looked at him, brows furrowed. "What do you mean? What's left to do?" "An official inquiry. We need to get the state involved. We need to get the public to demand accountability from them. We have to make them feel like they can't escape." It wasn't a simple move. A state inquiry would mean more eyes, more scrutiny, and it would put even more pressure on the administration. But Darius knew that if they didn't act now, the momentum they had worked so hard to build would fizzle out. The truth had to be heard, loud and clear, and there was no better way to make that happen than to force the administration into the spotlight. "Do you think the state will even get involved?" Sarah asked, her skepticism laced with uncertainty. "The university has power. You know they'll do everything they can to keep this quiet." "They're already struggling to keep it under control," Darius replied. "The more we expose, the harder it's going to be for them to hide. The state will have no choice but to investigate." It was a gamble, but it was their best chance at taking down the administration. If they could get the inquiry started, it would force the university to answer for its actions. But Darius knew that the university wasn't just going to roll over. They were going to retaliate, and it was going to get ugly. The next few days were a blur. Darius, Sarah, and Ethan worked tirelessly, reaching out to legal experts, talking to journalists, and gathering more testimonies. The pressure was mounting, and it felt like everything they had fought for was hanging in the balance. But even as the tension rose, something incredible was happening. The students were not just rallying for themselves anymore, they were rallying for every person who had been harmed by the system. The solidarity was stronger than ever. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Darius stood in his dorm room, holding his phone to his ear, as he heard the voice of a lawyer from the state's attorney general's office. "We've been following the coverage. The Attorney General has agreed to open an official inquiry into the university's practices," the lawyer said, his voice measured but filled with a sense of purpose. "We'll be conducting interviews with key witnesses and gathering evidence. You and your group have done a remarkable job bringing this to light." Darius's breath caught in his chest. They had done it. The inquiry was happening. This was the break they needed. "We'll need your full cooperation, of course," the lawyer continued. "This is going to get complicated, but I believe we can make a real difference here." Darius hung up the phone, staring at it for a long moment. The gravity of the situation hit him. It wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. It was a battle that could change the course of the university's history, and, with it, the future of so many others who had been hurt by its practices. The collapse of the university's carefully crafted empire had begun. Darius gathered his team. They had to stay focused. They had to continue pushing forward, because now, the fight was real. They weren't just fighting for their own futures. They were fighting for the future of the entire university. For every student who had been harmed. For every person who had suffered in silence. And as the campus braced for the inevitable fallout, Darius stood at the forefront, knowing that this battle, this reckoning, was only the beginning. The following weeks felt like a blur of chaos and strategy, as Darius and his team prepared for the official inquiry. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. What had started as a few protests on campus had now become an all-out battle for accountability, and the stakes had never been higher. The university's administration, once so powerful and untouchable, was now on its heels. The media coverage continued to grow, and the public's outrage reached a fever pitch. The university had tried to downplay the allegations, dismissing the students as troublemakers and claiming that the media was sensationalizing the truth. But it was clear that their usual tactics of denial and deflection were no longer working. The narrative had shifted. Now, it was the university that was under scrutiny, and the cracks in its armor were starting to show. Darius, Sarah, and Ethan sat in their makeshift war room, the small meeting room on the third floor of the student union, now their base of operations. The walls were plastered with printouts of articles, photos, and timelines of key events. Everything had to be perfect. The state's inquiry was scheduled for next week, and Darius knew that this would be the moment of truth. Professor Hargrove had been their most vocal advocate from the beginning, helping them navigate the complexities of the legal system and offering invaluable insight into how universities like theirs operated behind closed doors. But even she couldn't prepare them for what was to come. The university's power, after all, ran deep, and Darius knew that it wasn't just the administration they were up against. They were challenging an entire system, one that had been built to protect itself at all costs. The door to the meeting room swung open, and in walked Alicia, the graduate student who had been one of the first to speak out. Her testimony had been one of the most heart-wrenching of all. Alicia had been one of Halpern's many victims, but her courage in coming forward had sparked a chain reaction of other students and faculty members, each of them now ready to share their stories. "Hey, Alicia. How's everything going?" Darius asked, standing up to greet her. Alicia's face was pale, but there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She was no longer the scared, uncertain person she had been when she first came to Darius. Now, she was a survivor, and she knew it. The truth was in her hands, and she was ready to take on whatever came next. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. I know this is going to get tough, but I've never been more certain about anything in my life. Darius nodded. He could see the strength in her, and it was contagious. They had come this far together, and now, they had to make sure that the truth was heard, loud and clear. They had to make sure the world understood that this wasn't just about one professor, it was about a system that had been broken for far too long. The meeting continued, but Darius's mind kept drifting back to the upcoming inquiry. The state had already started gathering evidence, and the pressure was mounting. The university had hired top-notch legal teams to fight the inquiry, but Darius wasn't worried about that. They had the truth on their side, and that was something that couldn't be twisted or manipulated. That evening, after the meeting, Darius went for a long walk around campus. He needed to clear his head. The weight of everything, the protests, the interviews, the mounting media attention, had been exhausting. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the pace. But then, he remembered why he was doing this. He remembered the faces of the victims, their voices trembling as they shared their stories. As he walked past the university's grand, towering buildings, he couldn't help but think about the people who had built them. The ones who had created this institution, who had made it a symbol of power and privilege. They were the ones who had been responsible for protecting a system that hurt people, a system that silenced voices like his. But it was all coming apart now. And the university could no longer control the narrative. They couldn't hide from the truth any longer. The next few days were a blur of meetings, interviews, and last-minute preparations. Darius's team was working non-stop, making sure that all the documents, all the testimonies, and all the evidence were in order. They were preparing for the inquiry, but they were also preparing for what came after. The university would not give up easily. They would fight tooth and nail to protect their image, and Darius knew that there were still people in power who would try to discredit them, try to silence them. Then came the day of the inquiry. Darius stood in the packed conference room, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been to plenty of meetings and rallies, but this was different. This was the moment that everything they had fought for would come to a head. The room was filled with state officials, journalists, lawyers, and university representatives. The tension in the air was palpable. The stakes couldn't be higher. Darius sat at the witness table, flanked by Sarah, Ethan, and Alicia. Their faces were a mix of determination and nervousness, but there was also a sense of resolve. They knew what they were about to do. They knew they were about to change everything. The first few hours of the inquiry were filled with standard questions, procedural details, and testimony from other witnesses. But Darius could tell that the tone was shifting. The state officials were beginning to ask tougher questions. The university's representatives were growing defensive. And as each new testimony was given, Darius saw the cracks in the university's armor widen. When it was Darius's turn to speak, he stood up, his voice steady but firm. "This is not just about one professor," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "This is about a system that has allowed abuse to happen for years, a system that has protected powerful people at the expense of the vulnerable. The university has failed its students. It has failed its faculty. And it has failed the people who trusted it. This inquiry is the first step toward holding them accountable." His words hung in the air like a challenge. And for the first time, Darius saw the university representatives falter. They weren't used to being confronted with the truth so directly. For years, they had been able to control the narrative, to dictate what the public saw and heard. But now, the truth was in the room with them, and it wasn't going away. The room was silent for a moment. And in that silence, Darius felt something shift within himself. This wasn't just about exposing the corruption. This was about something much larger. This was about justice. This was about making sure that the people who had been hurt were never silenced again. The silence in the room after Darius's testimony felt suffocating, as though every breath was being held in anticipation of what would come next. The committee members, who had been scribbling notes, now looked up, their faces unreadable. On the other side of the room, the university's legal team exchanged uneasy glances, clearly rattled by the directness of Darius's words. Darius sat back down, his hands shaking slightly. He had said what needed to be said, but now the weight of the moment pressed down on him. This was the point of no return. There was no going back now. The university could try to bury the truth, but the state was watching. The media was watching. And for the first time, it seemed like the people who had been silenced for so long were finally being heard. The rest of the inquiry proceeded with more testimonies, but Darius couldn't help but reflect on his words. The reality of what they were doing was settling in. They had started something that could not be undone. The university, with all its power and influence, was being exposed for what it was. The system that had allowed abuse to thrive was now under a microscope, and there was no hiding from the truth. When the inquiry finally wrapped up late that afternoon, Darius, Sarah, Ethan, and Alicia walked out of the building in silence. The air felt heavy, as if the entire city had been holding its breath. The once strong facade of the university was crumbling, and it wasn't going to stop. Darius could feel the momentum shifting, but he also knew that the battle was far from over. "You did good in there," Ethan said, breaking the silence. He clapped Darius on the back, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "But do you think they're actually going to do something about it?" Darius thought about the question for a moment. He wasn't sure. The university had a lot of resources, a lot of power. But the truth was out now. The inquiry had been a game changer, and no amount of money or influence could erase what had been said in that room. The question wasn't whether the university could cover it up anymore, it was whether they could survive the fallout. "They'll try to cover it up," Darius said, his voice grim. "They'll fight back with everything they have. But they can't hide the truth. Not anymore." As the group walked through the campus, Darius noticed something remarkable. There were no protests today. There were no rallies or chants or groups of students huddled together in defiance. Instead, there was a quiet solidarity in the air, an unspoken bond among the students and faculty who had supported the cause. It wasn't about loud demonstrations anymore. It was about a shared understanding that something had changed, something irreversible. Darius knew that this wasn't the end, not yet. There were still battles to be fought, still more people to reach, still more work to do. But today had been a victory. Even if the full consequences wouldn't be felt for weeks or months, Darius knew that the university had been forced into a position where it couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The truth had won the first round. That night, Darius couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his dorm room, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the inquiry in his mind. Every word, every testimony, every confrontation with the university's legal team. It all felt like a blur, but it was a blur that had changed everything. Sarah had texted him just after the inquiry ended, asking if he was okay. He had texted back a simple message: "It's done. We've done all we can. Now it's out of our hands." But the truth was, it wasn't entirely out of his hands yet. The real work was about to begin. The university would undoubtedly fight back. They had already started a media blitz, pushing their narrative to the press and trying to paint Darius and his team as misguided activists. They would attack the credibility of the witnesses, they would question the integrity of the state inquiry, and they would use every tool in their arsenal to discredit them. Darius had seen it happen before. Powerful institutions, when threatened, would pull out all the stops to maintain their control. The next morning, the weight of what they had done sank in even deeper. It wasn't just the university's reputation that was at risk now, it was the entire system that had protected people like Professor Halpern for years. The inquiry was just the beginning. The world was watching, and the truth was out there, but the fight for justice wasn't over. Darius met with Sarah and Ethan that morning to discuss their next steps. The university had already started its counterattack, using the media to frame the inquiry as a politically motivated witch hunt. They were trying to discredit the whole process, but the truth had already spread far beyond the university's control. We can't let them turn this into a smear campaign, Sarah said, her voice tense. They'll try to twist everything. We need to keep the momentum going, keep pushing. We will, Darius replied. But we need to be strategic. We can't just rely on the media. We need more concrete action. We need to keep the pressure on the state. We need the public to keep talking about this. We need to make sure this doesn't fade away. It was a harsh reality. The university's counterattack had already begun, and Darius knew that if they didn't act quickly, it could derail everything. They needed to amplify their message and keep the conversation going. Especially in the face of the university's vast resources and media manipulation. I've been thinking, Ethan said, looking at Darius. What if we start organizing direct actions? Protests, marches, things that'll keep the issue in the spotlight. We can't just sit around and wait for the state to act. The pressure has to keep building. Darius nodded. We'll do it. But we need to make sure it's focused. We don't want the university to turn it into a distraction. Every move we make has to be calculated. This is bigger than just us now. This is for everyone who's been silenced. With that, the plan was set in motion. The inquiry was just the beginning, and as the pressure continued to build, Darius and his team knew that the Real fight was only starting. The days following the inquiry felt like a whirlwind. What had seemed like a decisive moment in the fight for justice had quickly turned into a larger, more intense struggle. The media had become an essential battleground, and Darius and his team found themselves not just fighting for accountability but for the very control of the narrative. The university's counterattack came swiftly. They mobilized their legal team and public relations department, flooding the media with press releases, op-eds, and interviews from key stakeholders. They painted themselves as the victim, claiming that the inquiry was an overblown reaction to minor incidents. They branded Darius and his team as radical activists with an agenda, claiming they had sensationalized the truth in order to disrupt the university's integrity. It was an all-out assault on their credibility, and it was working. But despite the university's best efforts, something had shifted in the public's consciousness. The press, the students, and the wider community were no longer easily swayed by the university's polished rhetoric. The truth had been spoken. It was too late to rewrite history. What had begun as an isolated scandal had now become a national conversation about power, privilege, and accountability. Darius stood before a crowded auditorium on campus, flanked by his closest allies, Sarah, Ethan, and Alicia, each of them looking determined but weary. Their faces reflected the toll the last few weeks had taken on them. The weight of their mission had only grown, but they were more resolute than ever. This was it. The moment they had been working toward, the final push to ensure that justice was served. The university had scheduled a public forum, a final attempt to regain control of the narrative. They had invited a select group of students, faculty, and administrators to discuss the fallout from the inquiry. It was supposed to be a reconciliation event, a chance for the university to make amends, but everyone knew it was just another publicity stunt. Darius had one goal for today, to expose the hypocrisy of the institution once and for all. The truth, no matter how hard it was to hear, needed to be laid bare. When Darius and his team walked into the auditorium, the atmosphere was electric with tension. A mix of students, faculty, journalists, and activists filled the space, their conversations hushed as they awaited the proceedings. The university had invited some of its highest-ranking officials to speak, President Lawson, Dean Randolph, and Professor Halpern himself. But as Darius entered the room, he could see that the students were not there to support the university. The whispers of dissent had grown louder, and the energy in the room had shifted. The forum began, with President Lawson taking the stage to deliver the university's opening remarks. Her speech was a masterclass in deflection. She spoke of how the university was committed to upholding the highest standards of academic integrity, and how they were deeply saddened by the events that had transpired. She spoke of healing and moving forward, but Darius could hear the underlying message: they were more concerned with preserving their reputation than confronting the reality of what had happened. When it was Darius's turn to speak, the room fell silent. He knew the stakes were higher than ever. His heart pounded, but he kept his composure. He walked to the front of the room and stood before the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces staring back at him. The tension was palpable. Everyone was waiting for him to speak, for him to reveal his next move. "Thank you, President Lawson," Darius began, his voice steady but firm. "You've spoken about the need for healing, for moving forward, but there's one thing that hasn't been addressed here today, the truth." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him, some skeptical, some curious, but most of them hungry for something more than corporate platitudes. "The truth is," he continued, "this institution, this university, has allowed abuse to thrive. It has protected the people who have taken advantage of their power, and it has silenced the voices of those who have dared to speak out." There was a murmur in the crowd. Some faces shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded in agreement. But Darius could see the unease in the university officials' faces. This was the moment when they could no longer deny what had happened. The truth was out. And there was no going back. He turned to the other side of the room, where Professor Halpern sat, his smug expression betraying the arrogance that had defined his career. Darius didn't flinch. Instead, he spoke directly to him. "You may have thought you could get away with it," Darius said, his voice cutting through the air. "But the truth has a way of coming to light, even when you try to hide it behind lies and manipulation. You've hurt countless people, and you've used this institution to shield yourself from the consequences of your actions." Halpern's face flushed, but he remained silent. His lack of a response spoke volumes. This was the first time he had been confronted directly, and Darius could see the cracks in his facade. The professor who had once been untouchable was now exposed for who he truly was. "Everyone here today knows what has been happening behind closed doors," Darius said, his voice rising with conviction. "We cannot let you erase the truth, no matter how many press releases you send out or how many smiles you put on for the cameras. The real healing can't begin until you take responsibility for what you've done. And that's what we're here for today." There was a pause before the room erupted in applause. It wasn't just the students who clapped, many of the faculty members, some of whom had been too afraid to speak out until now, joined in. It was a moment of solidarity, a powerful statement that the truth could no longer be ignored. The university officials, including President Lawson and Dean Randolph, sat in stunned silence. They were out of excuses. The students had made their voices heard, and the truth was no longer something they could bury. "We're not just fighting for ourselves," Darius continued. "We're fighting for every student who has been silenced, every professor who has been afraid to speak up, and every person who has been made to feel like their pain doesn't matter. The time for change is now, and we will not rest until justice is done." The room erupted into cheers, but Darius knew this was only the beginning. The battle for justice was far from over, and the fight had only just begun. The university would continue to try and discredit them. They would continue to spin their narrative, attempting to turn the tide in their favor. But Darius had made his stand. And now, the truth was no longer something they could control. The final battle wasn't about winning a single fight, it was about a movement, about a reckoning that couldn't be ignored. And as Darius looked around the room, he knew that they were on the right side of history. They were fighting for something bigger than themselves, and no matter what happened next, they had already won. The days following the public forum were a blur. The media coverage continued to escalate, and the fallout from Darius's speech reverberated far beyond the university. People were talking. Talking about the abuses, talking about the courage it took to speak up, and most importantly, talking about the change that was coming. The university's efforts to regain control of the narrative were no longer enough. The truth had found its way into the public's conscience, and there was no going back. Darius sat in his dorm room late that night, staring at his phone as it buzzed with new messages and notifications. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it felt different now. The sense of powerlessness that had plagued him for so long had finally started to dissipate. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger, a collective movement for justice, equality, and accountability. He looked over at the pile of books on his desk, untouched and gathering dust. Classes, assignments, and lectures felt irrelevant in this moment. The world outside was changing, and Darius wasn't going to sit idly by. He had a role to play now, and the weight of it was both daunting and liberating. His phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Sarah. He answered immediately. "Hey, Darius. How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice soft but full of concern. Darius took a deep breath. "I'm good, actually. I mean, it's a lot, you know. But I think we've finally done something real. People are listening now." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "We've made a lot of noise, but this isn't over yet. I'm proud of you, Darius, but we still need to keep the pressure on. The university's not going to go down without a fight. And they have money. They have influence. But we've got the truth, and that's all we need to keep pushing." Darius nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I know. But I feel like we're at the edge of something. If we can keep pushing, if we can hold on to the momentum, then maybe we can actually change things. Not just for us, but for everyone who's ever been silenced." "You're right," Sarah agreed. "We've already started something that can't be undone. It's going to take work. It's going to take time. But we've got the truth on our side." Darius smiled, feeling a flicker of hope. "Yeah. We do." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of action. The media attention did not let up, and neither did the protests. What had begun as small gatherings on campus turned into large-scale demonstrations, with students and faculty members alike joining the cause. They marched through the streets, chanting for justice, for accountability, for a new university, one where power couldn't be used to silence the voices of the oppressed. In the midst of all the noise, Darius's team worked tirelessly behind the scenes. They were strategizing, planning, and organizing their next moves. They held meetings, wrote petitions, and spoke to activists from across the country. They knew that they had to keep the pressure on, that this wasn't just about the university anymore. This was about the systems that allowed abuse and exploitation to flourish in the first place. It was about the larger societal structures that protected people like Professor Halpern, and the powerful institutions that helped them stay above the law. But with each victory came new challenges. The university's legal team fought back harder than ever, using every tactic in their playbook to discredit the activists and delay any real action. They tried to paint the protests as violent, as disruptive, as a threat to the very fabric of academic freedom. They sent letters to students, warning them about the consequences of participating in the demonstrations. They tried to divide the student body, offering incentives to those who chose not to get involved. But the more the university pushed back, the stronger the resolve of Darius and his team became. They knew they couldn't afford to back down. Every moment they spent on the front lines, every rally, every speech, every petition. It all mattered. It all counted. One afternoon, Sarah called Darius with some big news. "We've got it," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "The state has agreed to launch a full investigation into the university's handling of abuse cases. They're going to hold hearings, and this time, they're going to involve the broader community. This is the breakthrough we've been waiting for." Darius felt a surge of relief. It was a win, one that they had been working for since the beginning. But he also knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. The investigation would be long, and there would be more battles to fight along the way. They couldn't let up. Not now. Not when they were so close. As the weeks turned into months, the momentum didn't slow down. The investigation brought more survivors to the forefront, each one telling their story of abuse and cover-ups within the university. More and more people came forward, emboldened by the collective strength of the movement. They shared their pain, their struggles, their hopes for a better future, a future where institutions like this one could no longer hide behind their walls of power. The hearings were intense, emotional, and draining. But they were also a turning point. The truth was finally being acknowledged on a larger scale, and the university could no longer deny the weight of the evidence. Darius watched from the sidelines, knowing that their work was paying off, that every sacrifice, every sleepless night, and every tear was leading them closer to justice. And then, finally, came the day they had been waiting for. The university was forced to take responsibility. They announced a sweeping set of reforms to address the issues of abuse and discrimination on campus. They fired several high-ranking officials, including Professor Halpern, and committed to making lasting changes to their policies and procedures. The president of the university issued a public apology, acknowledging the pain and suffering caused by the institution's actions and promising to do better. It wasn't the perfect resolution. The damage had already been done. The scars would remain. But for Darius and his team, it was a victory, a hard-fought victory that had come at a great cost. They had won the battle, but they knew that the war for justice, equality, and accountability was ongoing. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. As Darius stood outside the university on the day the reforms were announced, he looked around at the crowd of students, faculty, and supporters who had gathered to witness the moment. He felt a deep sense of pride, not just for what they had accomplished, but for what they had started. The fight was far from over, but it had led to a new beginning, a new chapter where the voices of the oppressed would no longer be silenced. Darius had become more than just a student. He had become a symbol of resistance, a symbol of hope, and a symbol of the power that lies in truth and collective action. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could finally breathe. It was a quiet evening when Darius stood at the edge of the campus, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was a gradient of orange and purple, casting a soft glow over the familiar buildings that had once felt like a fortress, a place where he'd been bound by unspoken rules and expectations. Now, as he looked around, it felt different. Lighter. The weight of everything that had happened, the protests, the rallies, the betrayals, the victories, was still there, but it was no longer suffocating him. In a way, the fight had given him a sense of freedom he had never known before. The reforms had been enacted. The university had finally acknowledged the deep-rooted issues that had plagued it for so long. The announcement came with a wave of mixed emotions, relief, anger, pride, but also an unshakable feeling that there was more work to be done. It wasn't just about one victory, it was about building something better from the ground up. It was about making sure that the changes wouldn't just be a temporary fix, but a lasting transformation. Darius was no longer just a student. He was an advocate. A leader. And as he stood there, the reality of what they had accomplished settled in. They had changed the course of history at the university, but their work was far from over. Sarah and Ethan joined him on the steps, their faces tired but glowing with that same fire that had driven them all along. "You all right?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle but knowing. She could see the storm of thoughts swirling behind Darius's eyes. Darius nodded, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, I'm just thinking. About everything. How far we've come. It's hard to believe that this is real sometimes." Ethan let out a laugh, the sound easy and familiar. "I know, right? We started out just trying to stand up to one professor, and now look at us. We're in the history books, whether they like it or not." Darius smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of understanding. It's not over, though. This was just one battle. The real fight is out there. He gestured broadly, encompassing not just the campus, but the entire system they had been challenging. "We've sparked something, but we have to make sure it doesn't fizzle out." The trio stood in contemplative silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. What they had done was historic, but it was also just the beginning of something bigger, something that reached far beyond their university and their individual lives. It was about amplifying the voices that had long been ignored. It was about creating a world where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a reality. "I've been thinking about what happens next," Darius said finally, turning to face his friends. "We've built something here, and it's time we use it. We've got the platform, the experience, and the connections now. We need to keep going. There's a whole lot of work left to do in this world." Sarah nodded, her expression determined. "I agree. We've always said that we're fighting for the people who don't have a voice. But now that we've been heard, it's up to us to keep amplifying those voices. And to keep holding institutions accountable." Ethan, who had always been the more practical one, added, "Yeah, and we need to start thinking bigger. It's not just about colleges and universities. It's about the system. The way people like Halpern, people in power, get to decide who matters and who doesn't. We've made some noise, but we need to take that noise to the next level." Darius nodded again. "We need to build a network. We need to work with people who are fighting the same fight. People who are already making waves in their own spaces, activists, lawyers, educators, journalists. We can't do this alone." The plan was coming together. They didn't have all the answers yet, but they knew that they were ready to take the next step. They had become part of something much larger than they could have ever anticipated. What started as a personal quest for justice had turned into a movement, a cause that reached people across the country, even the world. The battle for justice didn't end with their victory at the university. It wasn't confined to that one moment in time. This was a lifelong mission, one that would require not just courage and resilience, but a deep, unrelenting belief in the possibility of change. A few days later, Darius received an invitation that changed everything. The invitation was from a prominent activist organization, an organization that had been at the forefront of several civil rights battles. They had heard about the work Darius and his team had done and wanted to talk about the possibility of collaborating on future projects. The opportunity was everything they had been working for. It was the chance to take their movement to a national scale. Darius felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This was the moment they had been waiting for, but it was also a huge step forward into the unknown. He wasn't just representing himself anymore, he was representing all the people who had come forward with their stories, all the people who had been silenced for so long. He called Sarah and Ethan immediately. "We've got to take this opportunity," he said, voice tinged with determination. "This is what we've been working for." "I'm in," Ethan responded without hesitation. "Let's do it. We've got the momentum. We can't let it slip away." Sarah agreed, but her tone was more cautious. "It's huge, Darius. This could change everything. We need to be ready for the pressure that comes with it." "I know," Darius replied. "But we're ready. We've been through the fire already. This is just the beginning of what we're capable of." And so, with that, the next phase of their journey began. The months that followed were filled with action, collaboration, and challenges. Darius, Sarah, and Ethan worked tirelessly to build connections with other activists, influencers, and legal professionals who shared their vision. They spoke at rallies, attended hearings, and pushed for policy changes on a national level. The movement that had started at one university had now become a national force, challenging oppressive systems and holding powerful institutions accountable for their actions. Despite the long hours and the pressure that came with their growing influence, Darius never lost sight of the reason they were doing this. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about recognition. It was about changing the world for the better, making sure that the future would be a place where no one had to fight for justice like he had. As the movement grew, so did Darius. He found his voice not just as an activist, but as a leader, a symbol of resilience and hope. He learned to balance the pressures of his personal life with his mission, finding strength in his relationships with Sarah, Ethan, and the other people who believed in the cause. The fight wasn't over. But as Darius stood once again on the steps of the university where it all began, He knew they had done something that would never be forgotten. They had sparked a revolution, one that was still growing, still evolving, and still changing the world. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?